Hi there. Thank you very much for tuning in. It is Dan Kurz, DK Analytics. It is April 5th, 2018. We're coming back 2 days after a rather lengthy video yesterday. We hope to make these more palatable, more digestible. But I'd like to offer somewhat of an update or augmentation to yesterday's email and drill down on a few things in a briefer, more manageable fashion. I'd like to look at something here that I've dealt with quite a few times and addressed in posts and in videos alike. And it might not be politically correct, but then again, neither am I. And I'm referring to what I call President Donald Trump's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde personality disorder or split. Now, we all have inner demons and we all have good and bad inside of us, but Donald Trump appears to do 180s and just go from one extreme to the other, sometimes within a period of 24 hours or less, that it makes one wonder what he truly stands for and what his core values are. And a lot of that has to do, obviously, with his heritage and his lineage and his long affiliation with the Democratic Party. Not that today's Republicans are any better, but he brings a lot of questionable statements out, or tweets, or whatever you want to call them, and then recites them half a day later. And just to give you a sense of how absurd this can be and why this needs to be taken with a grain of salt, consider on the campaign trail, as just one for instance, Donald Trump accusing Ted Cruz's dad of killing JFK. Right, Ted Cruz, the other leading Republican nominee or contender rather for the Republican presidential slot, and consider his close friendship with the head or the owner of the National Enquirer. I mean, this is just not solid stuff, right? These kind of statements or these kind of affiliations. And I'm not damning the man. I'm just saying you have to wonder, at the end of the day, when push comes to shove, what he truly stands for. And some of this stuff, unfortunately, finds its way into his policies, or better said, policy reversals, beyond the stout constitutionalist judges that he puts into place. So without trying to be too clever by half, as the Brits say, let me focus on the Mr. Hyde side of Donald Trump and tie it back into, instead of vetoing this absolutely reckless discretionary spending bill that he got of 1.2 trillion, up 13%, stuff with all kinds of bad stuff, right? He should have vetoed it based both on quantitative and on qualitative grounds. Quantitative meaning if the discretionary part of Congress or spending, of federal spending, can't be brought under control now, not only when then, but what are you going to do with the mandatory part, which can only be whacked at, if at all, when there's an emergency or when the bond vigilantes force it. There's some kind of dramatic situation that would force government to doing that beyond just printing things and paying for them, which is another can of worms that we'll touch on briefly here with. But on the discretionary side of U.S. government spending, right, it tells you a lot what a GOP, Republican-led Congress sent to him. And it tells you a lot not only about the Republicans, but also about the Democrats. Both are big spending parties. It's big spending with a right blinker, with a left blinker, all right? And if we take a look at this in the midst of a deficit with a run rate of nearly double last fiscal year's already of over $1.2 trillion, and we stuff this bill that's now been signed instead of vetoed by Trump into law, then let's take a quick look at some of the things that were stuffed in here for flavor of broken promises thanks to signing instead of vetoing on behalf of Trump, and what this means going forward. We've got a lot of Mitch McConnell, both pork and cronyism on board here. And we've got Chucky Schumer on the Democratic side, the head of the opposition, the minority party in the Senate, the Democrats, and people like him and Nancy Pelosi that have stuck a lot of lawlessness and questionable ethics into this bill that was signed instead of vetoed by Trump. So we got pork, cronyism, and lawlessness all tucked in. Let me give you just a flavor, and this is really what ails the beast. It's just a one-off or two or three examples, but really it's indicative of what's wrong with the entire process and the people representing the public. On the Republican side, we've got small college investment sheltering schemes and a tripling or a trebling of the depreciation rate on horse races. Both of those happen to favor Kentucky, which is the home of Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, the crony's crony. On the funding for lawless things, I'm talking about sanctuary cities, which are truly lawless cities. Why? Because they're harbors or safe havens for illegal aliens or criminals with illegal pedigree that the local authorities won't cooperate with federal agents to prosecute, to apprehend, to get out of the country. So this is nothing other than lawless, and it's tucked in and fully funded, and so is Planned Parenthood, which is a private outfit fully funded by the federal government that conducted over 360,000 abortions last year. And last but not least, Donald Trump, before this, offered as a deal to the Democrats to get them to the table a 1.8 million illegal alien pass. In other words, we'll make them legitimate, and we'll get them green card status and later probably citizenship. This is over 2 times the 800,000 that Obama sought. Now this is the opposite of what was promised, and it sets a very dangerous precedent in terms of offering potential third world immigrants a big fat green light to come over, because you come over illegally, you hang around long enough, will make you legal, and you will be able to participate in the social safety net or the transfer of property from U.S. citizens. This could not, these things in aggregate, both the Congress and the President on the GOP side, is not, especially based on Trump and his lacking veto here, the kind of things he talked about, the agendas, the promises he made in the campaign. Now, there's certain people that come out and say, oh, this is 3D chess and other such nonsense, and he's hoodwinking them and he'll fake them. Well, look, the art of the deal is not to offer 2.5 times the amount of illegal aliens that are made legal residents, but it's to make sure you get funding for a wall set up first, and then we'll talk about giving anything up there. And remember, the Democrats were only looking for 800,000. And already that's a travesty to any immigrant that came here through the front door and legally, on the one hand, and to the American citizens that are going to end up massively transferring their tax dollars to illegal aliens that get a cheering on by Washington, D.C. So questions here are, if spending can't be brought under control under the supposedly daddy party, the Republican Party, the GOP party, when it controls both the executive and the legislative branches, when then? And I said this the other day, but the sad answer is never. Because the Democrats, when they regain control of either chamber of Congress or the presidency, are just going to ratchet it up from here. We know that, right? So this is greasing the skids for even more outlandish spending, out of control deficits, and then obviously big question mark as to the viability of the dollar, among other things. This will only be brought under control when bond vigilantes will no longer put up with this. And that obviously is going to be accompanied with much higher interest rates than we currently have today, which is an impossibility on the face of it for such heavily indebted economies, the United States and the West. And there's similarity here throughout the OECD, by the way, especially in Europe. But what's the other thing? If we focus on the qualitative side, what this really amounts to is this. The rhinos, the Republicans in name only, running the GOP-dominated Congress just barely, that are really at the end of the day cronies, K Street cronies, that love illegal immigration, don't want to stop it. Mitch McConnell's, the Paul Ryans in the House, because illegal immigration, third world immigration, creates taxpayer-financed demand and cheap labor for their K Street pals, for their crony pals on K Street. And the Democrats, the Marxist Democrats, this is really what they are at this point. They love a strong flow and continued flow of illegal immigration because they will promise them all kinds of welfare, even if they are illegal. That's what we have now, and it will grow. And those people will obviously vote for Democrats. So the Democrats' agenda here is a strategic one. It's a long-term, one-party state system. In other words, rolling out Sacramento or California, one-party or Democrat rule from west to east. So both of these parties, the Republicans more on a tactical front and on a crony and a corporatist front, and the Democrats on a long-term agenda to turn the whole country blue or Democratic and one-party rule, and then you have communism outright. This is what ails the beast. So none of this supports Main Street, supports the heartland that elected Trump based on fidelity to the opposite of what is going on here by and large. That's the problem. Fortunately, Dr. Jekyll also shows up, not only in terms of judge appointments, which have been incredibly solid, but you would expect that, right, from a Republican president. But fortunately, Dr. Jekyll comes out of hiding also in Trump's Mr. Hyde / swamp monster dominated cabinet. And I'm going to take this from a great power website. I mentioned in a post I put out the other day whether truth-seeking alt-media sites will help move us back to the rule of law. You might want to take a look. But from a great website, Powerline, by author Stephen Howard, he said this about Scott Pruitt, the current head of the EPA, and I quote, "There's an old saying that when you're taking a lot of flack, you know you're over the target. Right now, this explains the liberal / media freakout about EPA Administrator Scott Pruitt. Pruitt is systematically dismantling the legacy of decades of egregious bureaucratic overreach by the EPA, including ending the corrupt sue and settle practice, stopping a practice which refused the sharing of raw data with outside researchers that bear or have impact on multiple $100 billion regulatory schemes. Multiple $100 billion regulatory schemes. And at the same time, deep sixing the so-called Clean Power Plan, which was likely to fail in federal court anyhow, unquote. That clean power plan was a green crony capitalist boondoggle delight that threatened progressively more brownouts and consistently higher power costs thanks to taking coal out of the energy production equation. By the way, not only will the media take Scott Pruitt take him apart, but more than that, the career leftist bureaucrats safely ensconced in this EPA, which shreds the Constitution in terms of regulatory dominance over lawmaking by the legislative branch, which totals property right protections in the process, they will be probably his biggest fight, because they will not want to let him execute the very corrective schemes necessary to get the EPA down to a less horrific size and scale. By the way, the EPA is the single most destructive, property rights eviscerating federal agency of all of them, because it shuts down businesses and has untold costs associated with perpetually rising proliferation of regulations. Don't forget that the administrative or the bureaucratic construct is housed within the executive branch, and they come out with roughly 50 times as many new laws. They call them regulations, but in effect they're laws, because if you don't obey them, there's criminal penalties associated with them in the extreme case. They come out with the vast majority of regulations, not legislators, and it is not in sync with the Bill of Rights at any level, the Fourth Amendment, the Fifth Amendment, and it also goes against a growing small business-led economic recovery. So if Pruitt can stay this course and make honest headway, and Trump can keep to the Dr. Jekyll and not flip-flop into Mr. Hyde and get pressured by the left-leaning media or his rhino colleagues, which are fine with this, as long as they find a way to benefit out of this complexity, such as via green energy cronyism, and that's a good thing. So hopefully Pruitt will be able to stay on board. Hopefully Trump will really back him when it counts. Regulatory compliance, and the reason I'm harping on this, is not a small matter. In fact, according to the American or the National Association of Manufacturers, the entire regulatory compliance cost in the United States exceeds $2 trillion a year. That's about 1/10 of GDP. Speaking of the EPA, again, this is ground zero, and this together with the IRS and getting this whole thing under control. We have the EPA thanks to a progressive Republican or big government Republican by the name of Nixon that brought it into existence. And to give you a very brief but down on the ground Main Street perspective into this, into the great paper chase, into the regulatory compliance costs, into how bureaucrats make great careers based upon regulatory compliance insanity and have defined benefit plans and better wages than most people in the private sector that end up not being able to hire people, invest, or even end up going out of business or have to go underground due to the regulatory insanity that is our current landscape. And that personal perspective that I'd like to offer you, a Main Street perspective, is as I try at the margin to bring some cash in the door while I build an internet publishing business or attempt to monetize DK equities over time. I have a little bureaucratic story of my own to share with you. It relates to my efforts to become a substitute teacher here in Southwest Florida, in Lee County, Florida. All right, so that I bring some much needed money into the household as I try with all my might to find a way to commercialize this website, to monetize this website, I should say. Now, you know what a substitute teacher does. Everybody does. A teacher calls in sick, they have a pool of substitute teachers, so you go in and you maintain the learning program and you make sure, you're a glorified babysitter at the end of the day. But here's what I had to do just to get on board. And this took roughly 4 months, all right? 4 months. I had to take courses and pass courses, and I have to read the list because I can't remember the whole thing by memory. Bloodborne pathogen exposure prevention, fire extinguisher safety, hazard communications, quote unquote, the right to understand. You heard right. I don't even know what that means. I don't think you do either. I had to take courses and pass exams on safety data sheets, bullying, quote, recognition and response techniques, asbestos awareness, state level, active shooter course and exam, acceptable use of technology, including all the cell phone stuff, social media, identifying and reporting child abuse, and then OSHA training and tests, EPA training and tests. In the interim, I had to pay for fingerprints and a criminal background check, an extensive physical exam, and a TB test. Yet, substitute teachers in Lee County that have to comply with all of the above each year, you get tested again. You got to go through this whole nightmare that make bureaucrats happy and well off and the rest of the story. I mean, we, or substitute teachers, make substantially less than 50% per hour of Lee County teachers. We don't get teachers' union benefits. We don't get teachers' defined benefit plan matching contributions. So we have to have all the requisite regulatory clearance of a regular teacher, make less than half the money, and then get classified as outsourced private sector employees. Well, a bit of a problem with that, as you can imagine, but that's a real-world example of bureaucracy run absolutely amok. Wouldn't you agree? Last but not least, I mentioned in the video from 2 days back about bond bubbles. I mentioned it multiple times. That we, in essence, in U.S. government bonds, treasuries, and frankly, most OECD bonds, whether it's Japan or France or the UK, are, in essence, junk bonds without any junk yields. And I'm going to also tell you that a lot of today's junk bonds don't have junk yields, but I'm getting ahead of myself. If we consider the huge insolvency or default risks associated with countries that, say, can't print their own money, or even those that can and have to resort to the printing press to avoid an outright default, deflate via the printing press through currency debasement, which is a piecemeal default with a hockey stick at the end when inflation really takes off, which happens at some point when you print too much money. I might touch on that in a second. But these bond bubbles are just so dangerous because if yields go up substantially, the value of bonds will pretty quickly drop by 20, 30, 50%. And even more, as I'm going to show you, not directly, but by implication with what's going to happen likely in the next financial debacle, which I'm going to tell you is going to be substantially worse than 08, 09 because we've doubled down on all the ailments of the last occurrence, namely even much more debt. We've added about 90 trillion globally to debt since then. Our productivity has been coming down and trending towards zero. We have huge dense energy issues. It's more and more difficult to get a lot of oil out of the ground at a reasonable cost. That also over time impacts the oil sister natural gas. And we have an aging population, all right? So if we throw all those things together, if anything, bonds should be priced at levels that give us much, much higher yields. Again, for de facto default risks on government bonds and real default risks on corporates or on lesser high quality corporates. So if we take a look at a few charts in terms of where these bonds would go, and we revisit first, let me touch on something briefly, and it's an indication of things getting tight that you might want to refer to. It's on FRED, on the Federal Reserve's site. It's a liquidity indication, liquidity in the euro-dollar market, the dollar-based euro-dollar market. And we're going to compare this to, it's the 3-month London interbank offering rate, right? The dollars available in Europe, short-term, liquidity, if you will, for corporates like commercial paper kind of stuff, and compare that with a 3-month treasury yield. And in times of tightness or solvency or liquidity concerns, you get a big gap up, right? Because the government can print the dollars to directly pay the treasury bills, but it takes more time to go outside of the U.S. system and de facto do the same for LIBOR, which in essence is what the Fed covertly ended up doing the last time we had a financial debacle in 08, 09. But take a look at this as a sign. Let me see if I get this right. Here it is. Here is the TED spread. Again, the difference between 3-month LIBOR, the London interbank offering rate, short-term liquidity funding in dollar terms in Europe, and the U.S. 3-month Treasury. Look at this spike here in 08, 09. And look at what we see here as a sign that might be worth, well, it bears watching, because if this also starts to really spike, that means we have big liquidity problems. If we have big liquidity problems, we have counterparty risk issues. Banks don't trust themselves. And then given the leverage we have, we quickly can march from liquidity into solvency issues as well. But with that in mind, as a kind of a canary in a coal mine, let me hark back for just a second to the 10-year Treasury to frame this. And here we go. I mentioned 2 days ago that we've been in a 37-year bull market where in the midst of Paul Volcker tough love in 81 as he tried to drive the fever of inflation out of the economy, we had 10 and 30-year Treasury bonds yielding over 15%. That was at a point in time when America public sector government debt was 33% of GDP. It's now about 105. But if all good things come to an end, a 37-year-old bull market doesn't go on forever, especially given the huge global solvency risks, heightened liquidity risks, huge productivity challenges, and higher dense energy issues. We're having a tough time getting enough oil out of the ground. And by the way, on that very front, consider this very important topic. Without massive amounts, the world consumes about 35 billion barrels of oil a year. It's about 33% of the globe's energy. Together with natural gas and coal, the other two main dense energy contributors, you're looking at about 85%. But it's getting harder to get that dense energy out of the ground, especially oil, and then with time natural gas, at a sensible price if you can find it at all. And to give you an idea of the leveraged output, and this is important to repeat, and I'll tell you why in a second. If you take 1 barrel of oil, right, or about 160 liters, and you convert it in terms of the heat it generates and the pistons or the turbines it spins into work, then 1 barrel of oil is the energy equivalent or the work equivalent of an agricultural worker toiling in the field for over 10 years, near 11, and a horse attached to a plow for over a year. Now, why is this so important? The leveraged output gives us the earnings power in the first place. And the earnings power is what enables us to buy shares of company, and over time, if earnings grow, our stake is worth more. Or it allows creditors, or debtors rather, to borrow funds. Now, if the very energy that allows this hugely leveraged, like a bunch of millions of energy slaves, extending our muscle and brain power, if that goes away or gets thrown into question, those earnings are going to collapse, and so are the values in the stocks and bonds that are correlated to them, or in the case of bonds, the ability to pay, right? So this is very important, but if we consider this here, we take a look at that this could go back up to 6, 7, 8%, we could go a lot higher, right? Given our much worse state of affairs. But my point is that over time, investors, bond investors, creditors, are going to worry a lot less about return on capital, but more about return of capital. Meaning the rising solvency risks, default risks that we face for all the reasons I just stated are going to be the main thing that bondholders look at, worry about, and try to price in. And what that means, by definition, as the world with over 233 trillion in debt and dwindling productivity and property right protections and an increasingly old society will definitely be looking at that, or the bond vigilantes will, and that will reprice bonds and stocks and everything along with it to the downside. And I'm going to say substantially to the downside. And if we imagine a 10-year treasury or a 30-year that, will have reversion beyond the mean, amplified by our much bigger hornet's nest of issues than in 08, 09, think about what that will do to corporates whose spread, or the premium above treasuries, is now in a comatose state. It's too low. That's the way it always gets at the end of business cycles. But take a look here at the spreads. This one here between a bottom rung investment grade, a BAA, corporate bond, and a 10-year treasury. And what the spread is going to show is how much higher the yield needs to be on the corporate than the treasury. And if we take a look here, before the 08-09 recession was about 2%, and it jumped at the peak of this financial debacle to 6%, all right? Now, let's say that we get a move in treasuries from, say, 3% to 7%, to 7%. And at the same time, those lower rung investment grade bonds require a premium above treasuries of not 2, but 6%. So we got a treasury going from, say, 4%, I'm sorry, from 3% to 7. We've got a 4% rise there in the treasury yield. And then we have a spread widening of this BAA 10-year corporate of another 4%. So BAA bonds could go from 4.5% to 12.5%. Now, if you put that into your HP12C calculator, whatever the newer versions are, that bond is going to get cut by 50% or more. And this is even more true for the spread between junk bonds. And like I said, I mean, these are even bigger junk bonds. They're corporates with double B ratings, non-investment grade. If we take a look here at historically the spread between the 10-year Treasury and a double B rated corporate, the first rung or the second rung in the junk bond, it's a high-end junk bond, then we move from 2.5% prior to the 08-09 financial meltdown, which just about took the whole system down with it. And the banks came in with liquidity and the printing press, and you know the story. But it went from 2.5 to 14.5, right? And then came back down. And we're now here at these levels of about 2.5%. So if we take a triple B, that currently yields about 5%, the 2.5 or 3% Treasury, plus this 2.5% spread. Let's just call it 5% is what a double B corporate bonds or high-grade junk bond requires. And Treasury yield goes up 4%. In other words, the flight to safety aspect of Treasury bonds gets trumped by either default or money printing or piecemeal default risks that we no longer have the 10-year Treasury, except perhaps for a fleeting time, as the go-to safe haven. Rather, it'll be a short-term thing and will quickly disappear, especially if the Fed comes out with massive amounts of QE. Then what we could see is the yield on a double B corporate, a 10-year corporate, move from 5%, 4% higher Treasuries. I'm going to say we'll go from 3 to 7. We could go a lot higher. And then the spread is going to open up to that Treasury by 12 percentage points. So we could go from 5% yield on double Bs to 19%. Now, all these came back down because the central banks convinced the world with massive move to zero interest rates and massive QE and buying, all the junk that everything was okay. And we've been in a comatose economic recovery since. But what happens if this time around the bond vigilantes with global debt, right, up by $90 trillion since 2007 to roughly 3 times global GDP? What happens if the bond vigilantes don't think that the bonds are going to be money good, either because of default risk on corporates or de facto monetary inflation-based default risk on the government bonds? Why then, those spikes in interest rates that proved to be fleeting in 08-09 on both the treasuries and the corporates might prove to be a lot more sustainable, meaning it'll lock people in to huge losses that might not disappear, especially if the global central banks double down on even more money printing, which they always do. By the way, as a point of information, the path to hyperinflation virtually throughout history with every nation has, as far as I know, always been through debt mountain-induced deflation, itself a result of money printing, which has been answered or tried to be avoided or battened down for a time through even more money printing, which then blows the lid off of things and causes the tendency of participants in the economic system to assume inflation is going to be here and it's going to increase instead of price decreases, just-in-time inventory, We could have people purchase in advance of inventory hoarding. That will cause the money multiplier to spring to life and a velocity, all right? And what's going to happen is, married to a gigantic and expanding monetary base, we're all of a sudden going to get way too much fiat money chasing relatively few goods and services. That's the classic definition of inflation. And hyperinflation is the child of a father, which is debt-based deflation, right? Excuse me. And by the way, I think I've said this someplace, but let me also throw this into the mix. In the first round of the next meltdown, or huge correction and reset in the asset markets, where stocks take it on the chin, what we'll have is people will sell things that are liquid. And I strongly suspect that initially both gold and massively under pressure silver will be down for a short period of time, because they're liquid, because they don't have counterparty risk, because there's no debt behind them, and they might get clocked short term, just as happened in '08. But as soon as people can separate the wheat from the chaff, they will run to real money and flee paper assets which are not money good, or bonds, or are massively inflated in terms of their earnings power, stocks, right? So those two things are truly tied to the hip. And I think I've gone over what I wanted to review as an adjunct. I hope you find this constructive as food for thought, in a contrarian sense if need be. Thank you very much for tuning in. That's all from here. It's Dan Kerr's DK Analytics. It is April 5th, 2018. I wish you a very pleasant afternoon and evening. Over and out.